I have no doubt that we are suffering from an acute housing crisis, such that we could qualify to put our hand up to the minister and say, hey, you know, we want to be included.
Welcome to Off the Record, a show about all things law for businesses in Queenstown. My name is Scott Donaldson, I'm with Mactodd.
And I'm Alice Milne, I'm with Mactodd as well. We're here today to talk about the burning question on everyone's minds, and that is, can my neighbour build three-storey dwellings right in front of my property, Scott?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and today we've got the perfect person to illuminate us on that question.
Absolutely.
And that is partner at Mactodd, Jane McDonald. Welcome, Jane.
Thanks, guys. It's nice to be here along to your talk show, so to speak.
Oh, we're so lucky to have you.
Thank
Perfect
you.
person to talk about this.
Great to be here. Yeah.
So what is the answer?
Wow, that's $1 million question. Not quite. Yeah, the short answer is no.
Yeah.
At the moment in Queenstown, your neighbour cannot build a three-storied dwellings in front of your property. But it's something that could happen in the future. So I think that's going to be a really interesting topic to talk about today, as to what moves there are nationally for that incentive to be rolled out, and how and when it might come to Queenstown.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the incentive of these changes, of course, is the government's move to address the housing supply shortage, which we undoubtedly have in New Zealand. Is that right?
That's right, and it's particularly evident in Queenstown, and there's a number of reasons for that. One of which, of course, is Queenstown is a beautiful, fantastic place to live, and more so in the last couple of years than Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. Queenstown has had more growth than those major cities, and it's because people want to come and live here. Yeah. And unfortunately, we have just not kept up the supply of housing with demand. The other thing that's been a constraint, and people blame the Resource Management Act, but it's true, our planning controls, like a lot of other countries around the world, are quite rigorous, and are a bit of a foot or a handbrake rather on development. And infrastructure funding is another big one. Yeah. We've blindly gone ahead and planned for development but forgotten about the all-important infrastructure, you know. And we're really out of step now, in Queenstown particularly, with our infrastructure and putting it in the ground to accommodate future growth and residential living.
Yeah.
So what is being done to address those issues, Jane?
What's being done? Well, there's a fabulous piece of legislation that is called the Resource Management Enabling Supply and Other Matters Act. So I don't really know what the other matters are, but perhaps they put a few other things in there that needed tidying up. Shortened version, it's the Enabling Housing Supply Act. And fundamentally, that piece of legislation applies to Tier 1 councils in New Zealand. So that's Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, Christchurch, and there might be a couple of others that escape me at the moment. Yeah. And the aim of that legislation is to increase housing supply. And the way that that is being done is that those Tier 1 councils are mandated to have to change their district plans to enable more housing supply. Yep. And that's the example you gave, Alice, where potentially your neighbour can build on any sized section, so it could be as small as 450 square metres, three-storey houses up to, I think it's 11 metres in height, 3 storeys, reduced car parking requirements, reduced building coverage, setback, etc. And the idea there is obviously that will increase the supply of housing, and theoretically at least anyway, reduce the cost to buy that product. Yeah. So those Tier 1 councils by August this year are supposed to have notified the changes as part of their district plans. There is a fast track sort of consenting process that those councils are going to sign up to, if you like. The Ministry for the Environment appoints a specialist panel who hear, so there is a submission process for people to voice their concerns or otherwise. Yeah. A decision is, or a recommendation is made by that panel, that recommendation goes to the council to either accept or reject. If a council chooses to reject the recommendation of the panel, the decision is then made by the ministry or the Minister for the Environment.
So once this process is essentially adopted into the district plan, the homeowners won't need to apply for a resource consent.
That's right. Yeah. If they comply with the fundamental standards relating to setbacks from boundaries, height limits, building coverage, outdoor living space, those sorts of things, yes, no resource consent is required. So you pop your plans into the council's building department, get your building consent, and away you go. So the first thing that you could know about it as the neighbour is when the builders turn up on site and start setting it out. Yeah. And there's nothing that you can do. Yeah. No resource consent required, so the process isn't able to be challenged. Yeah.
And helpfully, the Ministry for the Environment have put out a couple of pictures of what those changes, what you might see on your neighbour's property, and we're going to put those up on the screen now.
Yeah.
So could you just talk us through those, Jane?
Yeah, sure. So the first one that will appear on the screen is of a side-by-side development. And in that case, the area of the site is 416 square metres, so quite small, quite a bit smaller than your average sort of Queenstown low-density sites, which are required to be a minimum of 450.
Right.
That has 3 units on it that are 95 square metres each. There's 3 floors per unit. There's building coverage over the whole site is 22.5%, which is actually quite low. Here you can have building coverage of 40% as of right, and the standards, as I understand it, allow building coverage to go up to 50%. And you've got outdoor living space per unit, which is on the ground floor in this case of 15 square metres, so quite a small area, but sufficient enough to be able to step outside and get a breath of fresh air, which is good once in a while, and maybe have your barbecue and a table and chairs out there. So that is the first sort of option, the side-by-side development. The next one, we've got a stacked sort of arrangement, again, same site area. We've got 3 units, 82 square metres each. There's 1 floor per unit, so here you've got the units on top of each other rather than being side by side, and again you've got outdoor living at 15 square metres on the ground floor. The upper floors have got some balcony provision there, which provides for that outdoor living. Finally, one which probably will apply, I think actually more so than the other two, as people want to maximise spare space that they've got on their own land, so they've got their own home, and you've got the infill development. So on this slide you can see that at the rear of the section there, you've got 2 70 square metre units that have been built, and again they've got the outdoor living space of 15 square metres, and there's 2 floors per unit. So that sort of infill arrangement might be more what we commonly see here in Queenstown, where people have built their residential flats. So they're your extra income, earning potential that we have at the moment, and they're smaller than the main residential home. But I think that could be something that you see quite a bit of with that infill development, because people have lovely homes in Queenstown. They've got lovely sites. They've got lovely views.
Lovely views.
Yeah.
So I can imagine if I was a homeowner in Calvin Heights and my neighbour at the front of me built a 3-storey dwelling in front of me that blocked my view of the lake, there'd be a few feathers ruffled, no doubt.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, not that it's a bad thing, but we've become quite precious about our amenity and our views. We spend a lot of money as Kiwis, particularly in this part of the world, building our lovely homes on sites for the views. And the potential for that to be diminished quite significantly by this sort of development that's contemplated by this legislation is quite a concern. And I think that leads on to the issue that the government really doesn't have a lot of information on at the moment, but that is the effect that private covenants might have on frustrating the aims of this legislation, because there won't be many modern Queenstown subdivisions stretching from potentially Calvin Heights out to Shotover Country and Bridesdale, places like that, where development covenants have been put on which restrict the ability for further subdivision or further building development, or they may well entrench the building coverage rules. So it remains to be seen whether those covenants will frustrate the objects of this legislation.
Yeah, we'll come back to covenants in a minute, if you don't mind, when we just start talking about how this is actually going to impact on Queenstown.
Sure.
I'd like to know, is Queenstown affected by these changes, or could it be affected?
Yeah, so the short answer is at the moment no, because Queenstown Lakes is a second tier local authority, so we're not automatically captured by the legislation. But that doesn't mean to say we can't be. It's open to Tier 2 councils to have to comply with this legislation if they're suffering from an acute housing crisis. And I would have to say that Queenstown certainly is. It's something that we've been crying about in the news for many years. We've taken our own initiatives with the Affordable Housing Trust and things like that to try and help us deal with that issue. So I have no doubt that we are suffering from an acute housing crisis, such that we could qualify to put our hand up to the minister and say, hey, you know, we want to be included. There's one other local authority in that boat at the moment, and that's Rotorua. So they've approached the Minister for Housing and Environment, who have agreed that they can avail themselves of this legislation. But Queenstown hasn't yet.
Right.
I'm not aware within council, for example, to whether that's something they're contemplating.
Right.
To some extent, or to a large degree, it takes control away from the local authority, because there are some exemptions in the legislation as to where this housing supply provision might not apply, but they're very slim. For example, they wouldn't apply where there's a designation for a public work for obvious reasons. They might not apply in special character areas. So, for example, parts of Arrowtown which have particular special heritage status where it would be completely ruined by this sort of development. But beyond that, I would say they would apply in nearly every residential type of zone in Queenstown. So that's Jack's Point, low density residential, Quail Rise, for example, you know, a number of those other residential flavoured type zones.
Yeah. We've kind of talked about this legislation in quite a negative way, but there's actually a lot of people who might see it as a positive. So if you're a business in Queenstown who's struggling to get staff, you might see this as a way of resolving some of the accommodation issues. And so there will be a lot of people in Queenstown who do want this to happen. And so what is the process? Can we affect the decision by the minister to put us into the affected category, or is it just something we have to wait till council decides?
Yeah, it'll be driven by the council approaching the ministers of housing and the minister for the environment. I can't see any other lobby group necessarily making any leeway, mainly because it's going to be for the council to have to resource a plan change to introduce these provisions into their district plan. And if you've got an unwilling council who's under-resourced, you know, it doesn't make for a happy sort of marriage, if you know what I mean. I still think, though, there's a place for local business to lobby the government. And I mean, that's a good point that you make, Scott, about businesses seeing this as an opportunity to provide for some much-needed housing for their staff. You know, at the moment, the planning rules, particularly in and around Queenstown, where people can walk to work and things like that, are still quite restrictive in terms of the density of residential accommodation that can be built. And there's a real opportunity here for employers potentially to pick up some of that older housing stock and to replace it with something new and something that's fit for purpose for their staff and affordable.
So at some point, the council's obviously going to have to deal with this issue. And we talked before about how Queenstown really does have an acute housing shortage. And I thought earlier about the kind of interrelationship between this and the proposal to require developers to give some of their sections to affordable housing on the basis that there is an acute housing shortage. So it'll be interesting on the one hand if Queenstown said, well, we've got an acute housing shortage, therefore we're going to require developers to give up some of their land, 10%. But on the other hand, we're not going to make an application to the government because we don't have an acute housing shortage.
Yeah, I know. I can see that could seem to be two ends of the spectrum, sort of wanting it both ways, isn't it? I mean, you're right. There are two issues at play, I think. One is the supply of land for housing, which is on a more of an economic, I won't say straightforward sort of proposition, but supply and demand, price, they all easily relate to each other, very easy to understand. An added complexity then is affordability. And I think, that's where you've talked about the developers being required to contribute something to the greater good. And, that's could be a topic for another day, and it's going to become a hot one in Queenstown because they're about to have a plan change on it. But that's something that we call inclusionary zoning, where a developer's required to give a certain percentage, either of the value of the land or the land itself, to affordable housing. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that increasing housing supply is going to fix our affordability issues, particularly when you consider the range of income earners that we have living here and that are going to continue to live here so long as Queenstown is a tourism
hotspot.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. So this question is going to have to be addressed by council, and then at some point either the council will or won't ask the minister to make a recommendation. The minister could still potentially make a recommendation even if council didn't agree. That's right.
It's up to the minister. And I have anticipated that it will be councils approaching the minister like they've done in Rotorua to come into the regime. But it could well be that the minister sees a council that is shying away from its duties and said, no, you guys, you're going to have to come to the party and do this. And that could happen. It'll be an interesting one to watch is going to be what happens out on the Ladies' Mile. So that's not quite, I would say, the intensity of residential development that's enabled by the Housing Supply Act, but it's a master planned exercise that is about to be publicly notified by the council for quite a different and more intensive style of development than we've seen in Queenstown of late. So on the Ladies' Mile, it's quite a strategic area. The council acquired that land not very long ago for public purposes on the Ladies' Mile there. The Ministry of Education is looking for a new high school site, and the council has applied to the minister for that process to go down the special fast track route as well, which again will be open to public submission but no appeal rights. And that's sort of a first step forward for this council to do something that is heading towards more intensive housing development and intensification of supply. So it will be very interesting to watch that track through, and particularly if it gets accepted for that fast track process.
The question that we asked at the start of this podcast was, is my neighbour going to build a 3-storey building on their property? Is my view going to be affected? And it's likely that private covenants are going to play an important role in that. And certainly if I own a property at Jack's Point, if I own a property at probably Millbrook's not as relevant for different reasons, but if I've got a private covenant that says my neighbour can't subdivide, is that going to prevent this from happening on my neighbour's property?
Yeah, at the moment, yes.
Yeah.
So the legislation doesn't have the effect of putting to one side or overruling private covenants. However, that's not to say that might not happen in the future. So the government's preparations for introducing this legislation did look at covenants and whether they were effectively going to kibosh it right from the start. And they concluded that at the moment they just don't simply have enough evidence about the effect of private covenants related to implementation of the goals of this legislation. As I said before, many of the more recent subdivisions in Queenstown Lakes do have those sort of covenants on them, which, may well be potentially a reason why we haven't seen the Queenstown Lakes Council say to the government ministers, hey, we want in on this action, because it might bear very little fruit for those areas which are suitable for that.
And that's a huge policy consideration. It's going to incentivise future land developers to use covenants to effect their purposes, to supersede that legislation.
Yeah. It also might provide the council with a convenient kind of out for it. They could say, yes, sure, we'll make an application for this to apply to us, and we'll make it apply to Shotover Country and Henley's Farm and all the new places, and then knowing that those places will be prevented from intensification anyway because of private governance.
Yeah, I would have to say it would be a very brave government that decided to enact legislation that completely overruled private contracts between parties in this sort of situation. I think it's if those private covenants in a particular area are going to put a dampener on achieving the legislation's purpose, then we're going to have to look at some other way.
Yeah.
It significantly undermines that quite.
It's a fundamental
system.
Yes.
Brave is one word, and I wouldn't describe this government as brave, but there's other words that I would use.
I wasn't saying it was this government that was going to do it. However,
Scott just can't resist. No.
Okay, so let's talk about specifically in Queenstown, because I think people listening to this will really want to know what areas might be affected. So is it fair to say that it will be, if we assume the private covenants will stay on, will be effective, and so what areas can we expect might be affected? Is Arrowtown, for example, going to have these new rules applied to it?
There's no reason Arrowtown wouldn't. From a exclusionary perspective, in terms of areas that might have a special value, the only part of Arrowtown I could think residential zone that might be excluded is the historic part of Arrowtown. But the rest of Arrowtown, I couldn't see any reason why it wouldn't be included. Calvin Heights, Arthur's Point, all of Queenstown, Frankton, Remarkables Park.
With that sort of older housing, potentially right for that.
Some of the older housing stock is at what we call the old Frankton or Nappy Valley, they used to call it, and I would be surprised if there's a great deal of or a great number of covenants on those titles out there that prevent, because it wasn't, I think, when those sections were being developed, there was no need or desire to prevent people from re-subdividing potentially, or whereas I guess the covenants come with some of these more exclusive subdivisions. Or you've got the likes of some of the Aspen Groves, or some of those more what you might call exclusive subdivisions, where part and parcel of the appeal and the price range is that that your neighbour can only build to a certain height, or of a certain design, or a certain coverage, and people pay extra money to buy into that amenity and
to open up their
that
curtains
certainty.
And see the Remarkables every morning.
That's right.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it'd be interesting to see what effects, if this comes into Queenstown, that's a big if, isn't it? Because,
it is a big if,
there's a lot of water to pass under the bridge before we get anywhere near that, but it'll be interesting to see what happens to the property market in Queenstown, for example. I mean, some properties will probably go up, some properties will potentially go down.
Possibly,
and maybe some good opportunities for people to, like you said earlier, to build a couple of units on the back and realise the value of their house.
That's right. Yeah, or even communal, not communal, co-living with families is becoming more popular now.
Yeah.
So it's the bank of mum and dad rather, it may well be that they make it that you can make available extra land on your section, and you can have extra houses built there for your family to live nearby. So that's an option too.
Yeah.
So I guess the big question then is this going to solve our housing shortage, Jane?
Do you have a crystal ball there?
Yeah, next Christmas it'll all be sorted.
Look, I'd love to say that something like this would, but it's a lot more complex than that. Certainly, it's not really going to solve anything for the Queenstown Lakes. And I actually, my personal view is that this isn't a fit for purpose fix for Queenstown. I think we can do better than this.
Yeah.
And as I say, I think we should watch closely what's happening out on the Ladies' Mile, because there's been a lot of planning and effort and some really good minds and planning minds experience put into that master planning process out there. And I'd like to think with all the effort that's been put in, that is something that we hopefully should look to roll out across the district when the council starts planning on other areas, that it's going to open up rather for land supply. One of which is what we call the Southern Corridor, which is heading down towards Kingston, taking in all the land out beyond Jack's Point. That's another area that we should be watching, because that's on the council's radar as somewhere where additional growth can be accommodated.
Yeah. Some more bespoke response to a
It is.
issue.
We are unique,
and
it does concern me that there are initiatives within this current government to roll out national planning standards that might be thought to be, fit for all. But I think we can do better than that. We've always been in Queenstown at the forefront of doing things differently and better. Yeah. And I think we can come up with our own solutions, hopefully, without having to have them imposed on us by central government. Yeah. That's what I'd like to see.
Watch this space.
Yeah. Without sort of being too critical of Queenstown, we are also the town of NIMBYs as well, really, aren't we? So,
well, there's a lot of towns of NIMBYs throughout New Zealand, but as I said at the start, Queenstown is a beautiful place to live, and people will continue to come here and live here. We've got something great to offer, and we do have a lot of wealthy people living here too, and they've got deep pockets, so they're prepared to fight for what they want and enjoy, and the reason they've come here. So I'll leave NIMBYism for another day too, because I could sort of go on about that for a long time. But if we want to have it all, something's got to give, and the NIMBYs are going to have to give.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because people's quality of life is affected by the ability to have workers in town, for example, who can have an affordable place to live and want to come here and don't feel overburdened by the housing costs.
Exactly, that's right. And that comes at a cost of having to give something up to the others have the opportunity.
Yeah, although it might be the guy down the road that should give it up, not me.
that could be right.
Oh, Jane, thanks for sharing your wisdom. It's such an interesting topic.
It's been a pleasure to be here talking.
Well, it's really important that developers, homeowners, real estate agents, people really get their head around this legislation, isn't it?
It is, and I also think, but also just to be wary of the changes that the council itself is doing, and to take part in the consultation, because the council, people get a bit sort of sick of it all, I suppose. It can cost money to be involved, hiring lawyers and consultants, and they get a bit apathetic. But now more so than ever, I think people need to take real notice of what the council's planning, what they're doing, the spatial planning exercises they're going through, because this is where the difference is going to be made. Yeah. And this is council trying something new and trying to solve a problem. Yeah. So we need to be part of the solution to that and be involved.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, it was great having you on, Jane. Really appreciate it. And if people want to get a hold of you, they can get a hold of you at Mactodd.
They sure can.
And anything else to add?
No,
Alice?
I think that's all we've got time for. It's time for a Friday 5, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
sounds good. Bit dry.
Oh, thank you very much.